Good morning.
Good morning.
I will begin with just having you state, for the audio archival purposes, some basic information about yourself. So the first question is, please tell me where and when you were born.
I was born in 1950 in Henderson, North Carolina,
So
a
you're
little
a
north
Tar
of
Heel.
Raleigh. Yep, born and bred.
Okay. And you grew up there your whole life?
Yeah, and I went off to school for a couple of years in high school and then off to college. So I guess I left there in '66, except for summers, and I was working there and other places. So pretty much until '66, '68, I lived there.
Okay. You currently are enjoying retirement.
I am, very much so.
But what did you do for a living?
Oh, lots of different things. Started out teaching school for a year when I got out of undergraduate school. Then went back to school part-time at NC State and was hired, worked with Dr. John Miller over there for 16 or 17 years as a research technician doing research on primarily little marine fish. And got a master's degree from State while I was over there doing that too. So after that, I went downtown for a year and a half with the Outer Continental Shelf office. Was the biologist on the staff that was coordinating the state's opinion on the proposed mobile oil well, exploratory well off Salvo. And then that job ended when gas prices tumbled and mobile went away. And my job went away, so I came home and started doing fishing schools. I had been doing the NC State sport fishing schools since 1986 when I was on the staff at NC State. And so I continued with doing that on a contract basis with them and developed 6 to 8 other programs, which I did off and on from 93 until 2012 or 13, I guess. Maybe, yeah, probably 13, 12, I forget. So I think it was 2012 was the last year I did some surf fishing schools. So.
Okay. What's your current relationship with the fisheries environment?
I'm a recreational angler, and that's about all I do with them. And I don't do a whole lot of saltwater fishing much anymore, but I go some every year. I probably used to spend 30 to 40 days a year fishing in saltwater and about that many in freshwater, and now I spend probably 40 days a year in freshwater fishing and more like 20 in saltwater now, but it varies year to year.
So this is sort of a redundant question based on your answer, but has this relationship changed over the years? You sort of just
it's changed some because a lot of it early on, some of my interaction with the fish in saltwater was business related, and so since I'm not working in that field anymore, then those opportunities have gone away. And as I sit here and think about it, Sarah, I forget that I do travel some and fish when I'm out of the country or in Alaska or somewhere else, and so I haven't counted those. So I may be close back to where I was originally. I don't know. I don't keep track of it. I don't keep a log. It would be interesting to do that, but I don't.
Okay. So now we'll turn to more of the specifics of your involvement in fisheries management and policy generally. Why did you become interested in fisheries management and policy, or perhaps restated, how did you get involved in fisheries management and policy? What was that first sort of toehold?
Yeah, well, the involvement in management came through research primarily. As my job at NC State led me there, we interacted quite a bit with the Division of Marine Fisheries and tried to focus our research on issues and questions that were important to the Division of Marine Fisheries, and trying to help them out some. My master's work was involved with nursery area utilization by spotting croaker and flounders and all those winter spawn species. And so we were trying personally, and as well as the research that Miller and others were doing, other graduate students were trying to get at some information that might help direct or inform the division's management policies. So that was my introduction and direct connection early on. But from a personal perspective, I've always just been enamored with fish and the water and marine resources in general, and always saw it as important that they continue on and exist for the pleasure of myself and my kids and everyone else. So I had a personal interest in the results of management and how things were being managed and hopefully successfully. So I guess one thing that struck me early on was that, in my mind, I was not aware of the North Carolina Fisheries Association early on, and I'm talking early on back in the mid to late 80s. I felt like that both the commercial industry as well as the recreational industry needed some sort of representation at the table. I didn't see NCFA being very active at that time. I saw them get very, very active after that as I became more involved in management. But there was little to no involvement, organized involvement by recreational anglers. So Coastal Conservation Association started in the late 80s. I became involved in that because of what I just said. I think everybody needs to have a voice at the table and some sort of representation and organizational structure. So, people, I think a lot of people have a wrong opinion and are wrong-headed about what they think CCA represents or did represent anyway. But anyway, I got involved with them because that was the only organization in town that was doing anything. There were a bunch of fishing clubs in the state, but they purposefully chose not to be political. They wanted their meetings to be about fishing and catching fish, and they absolutely refused for many, many, many years to ever get involved in the policy side of things. So they bitched and moaned about it a lot, but they didn't want to get involved and do anything. So when CCA came along, it was a vehicle to kind of fill that hole or provide some input from the angling community, and I saw that as important. So I got involved with them, and that led to participation in meetings, and then when the FRA came through and the commission or the new law, I guess, put a lot more emphasis on public involvement, then I became very involved in that as well.
Okay. I think you pretty much said this, but just to restate for the recorder, why does fisheries management matter?
It's a personal thing, really. I mean, it matters to me because I have a great appreciation for those little critters, and I want to see them survive and flourish and be available for folks to enjoy whatever way they choose to.
So now we're going to reflect back specifically at the Fisheries Reform Act of 1997. And as we just discussed, the North Carolina General Assembly was compelled to take action in 1994. And you were sort of in the circle at that time, with CCA. Why do you think the General Assembly, in your opinion, took action in 1994?
I think it reflects directly upon the birth of CCA in North Carolina. I mean, a lot of people know the history of that organization, and was developed along the Gulf of Mexico, the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and because of the same reasons that they became established here, and this exact same reason that the Fisheries Reform Act was implemented, passed and implemented, developed, passed and implemented. And that is because things had changed very drastically on our coast. It's well reflected in the landings history and the commercial landings history. If you look, things peaked in about 1980, 81, 82, and they were out of control. There were few regulations on the industry, And it was a heyday for the industry. They loved it, but they'll never see it like that again. And I think up until that point, Sarah, in my mind, there were no need for activist recreational anglers because everybody that went to the beach or went to the coast, there were plenty of fish to be caught. Nobody moaned and groaned about it. You know, you went around the gill nets in your boat and you went and you fished and you had a good day and caught some fish. And I think with that huge increase in landings from the commercial industry, anglers started seeing trips where they went, whoa, what's going on? You know, I used to be able to come down here and catch X and Y and take what I wanted home or whatever. And it was changing quite a bit then. So anglers said something's got to be done about this. I think what inspired the industry was after those high years of very, very high landings, management was struggling to try to keep up with activity in the industry and started ratcheting down the industry, both on a federal level and not so much on the state level, but some. And so the industry started getting involved, was forced to get involved in that. So anyway, I think that's the impetus for the FRA, that there were some major changes in landing and it affected people's activities and livelihoods, and realized that, you know, we couldn't keep going the way we had been forever.
Do you think there was a particular circumstance that led to the creation of the Moratorium Steering Committee, or just general circumstance? Was there like one key moment where it was like, now we're going to do the Moratorium Steering Committee?
No, I don't think there was one key moment. I think it was a kind of a snowball rolling downhill. You know, CCA started out very, very small. Anglers' voices had never been at the table before because they didn't need to be at the table. And here you got some new people that are saying, hey, there's something going on and we need to do something about it. People that the management, the Division of Marine Fisheries and the Marine Fisheries Commission had never heard from before, or heard very little from in the past. That's to my knowledge. So I think this new upstart organization and the conflict that they had directly with the commercial industry made some noise that was noticed by the politicians and the legislature and all of that, and the management agencies, and that's my opinion.
How were you involved specifically with the Moratorium Steering Committee process?
You know,
and if you weren't, and say you weren't, but because I don't really know the answer to that.
I don't know the answer to that either.
I know you weren't on the Moratorium
Steering Committee. I was not on the
But
Moratorium Steering Committee. I attended meetings.
Part of those public meetings.
I sure did, and provided input and opinion. I wanted to be on the Moratorium Steering Committee and was not selected. I offered to serve and was not selected to be on the committee. So I provided input at every public meeting that I could get to, and best I remember, I traveled some to do some of those, but not a lot. I didn't go all over the state or anything. So, but I knew a lot of people that were on the committee, and so I had direct input through representatives on the Moratorium Steering Committee. They didn't always listen to me, but you know, that's still the case.
Do you think the various stakeholder groups were united in wanting passage of the Fisheries Reform Act? Why or why not? So basically, it's kind of like, was there unanimous that something needed to be passed? Maybe not the specifics, but was there sort of consensus among stakeholder groups that something needed to happen, or
yes.
Not at all?
I think there was consensus among most of the stakeholders that something needed to be done, or most, I'll say many of the stakeholders that something needed to be done. I think there was pretty unanimous opinion from the recreational side of things that something needed to be done. And I think there were some enlightened members of the commercial industry that realized that something needed to be done as well. So some of the rest of them got dragged screaming and kicking, I think, down that road. But, you know, NCFA was at the table and participated, but there was a bunch of dragging and kicking and screaming, I think, from that group, at least for a while, until they saw it was inevitable. And then they became a little more actively involved in trying to get things done that weren't going to impact them as much as they might have.
And I find this question, just from a personal, like going off script, I find this question interesting because when I first took my job, part of the reason I always heard that the commercial sector wanted some kind of passage of a Fisheries Reform Act was because they were afraid of people entering our fishery. There had just been gill net bans in Florida and everything, and everybody was worried that they were going to come fish in our waters and take our share of the pie, and so that there was some kind of commercial support for,
there was
some, and so you know, I don't know how much truth there is to that. That's why I was really interested in your.
No, there's definitely some truth to that, and there were some enlightened, I call them enlightened members of the commercial industry who saw some issues with sustainability with the way things were going. I mean, I remember Willie Phillips, who was served on the first new commission, felt he participated in the blue crab fishery and still does, and he felt very strongly that there needed to be some reforms in the blue crab fishery. That was the first FMP that the new commission messed with. They didn't do a whole lot with it, in my opinion. They didn't go down the road as far as I think I would have liked to have seen them, and as far as Willie would like to have seen them. So, to answer your question, though, yes, there were Melvin Shepard, who was in the industry, and Murray Fulcher. I remember being very active at that time as a fish house owner and fisherman, and a number of others who participated in the fishery as dealers and as fishermen. You know, so felt strongly that something needed to be done, and I think you're right with the net ban in the early 70s in Florida, and may have been in the 90s. I don't know. I can't remember the dates on that. But yes, there were fishermen from Florida. I remember mullet fishermen and new boats and people seeing them, and some of the folks, fishermen in the industry, felt threatened by this new participation because anybody could get a license. The dealers didn't care. Mm-hmm. From my perspective, the dealers loved it. More fishermen, more fish. So that's where the bucking and the kicking and screaming came from, as it generally does to this day from the dealers, the big dealers. But the fishermen themselves, lots of them felt like, they didn't need this enhanced competition, and so they were willing to sit at the table and participate,
Who were the significant leaders of the Fisheries Reform Act that you know about, and if you can, describe their specific roles?
Well, I hit on a couple of them, I think, already with Melvin. I remember him being very active in it. I remember Murray Fulcher, I think, being very active in it. And I may be getting confused because I worked with both of those guys afterwards on committees of the newly established commission and all of that. So I remember B.J. Copeland being very involved in it. Of course, he was asked to participate. I think he did it gladly so. Bob Lucas, I don't remember whether he was involved so much in the early stages, but was the first chairman of the commission that Hunt appointed, and I knew Bob some before that. I knew he was going to be involved, and he took his role very, very seriously. So even before the new commission and the FRA was implemented, you know, Bob was active trying to develop a good sense of what people thought. So he was involved much earlier than, his appointment as chairman. Dick Brain was involved from the recreational side. I don't recall, maybe Bill Brown from Greenville was a CCA type. I can't remember who was actually on the committee other than a handful of those folks, and some of them may not have been active on the committee.
Who were the political champions, I guess, of the Fisheries Reform Act? I mean, obviously there had to be somebody on the inside that sort of
Bass Knight was involved in it, I think, pretty heavily. Gene Preston. Most of the coastal legislators were involved. Charlie Albertson, I remember, as being a participant in that. I guess I served on the Seafood and Aquaculture Committee, and I was trying to remember when that was. I thought I made some notes, but I must have left them on another sheet. and I can't remember exactly when I got appointed to that, but I think it was in the mid to late 90s, and I served. Jerry Schill was on the seafood and aquaculture the same time I was. So I think it predated the FRA, or was right about the same time. And Charlie was one of the co-chairs of that, Charlie Albertson. So, that was about the only fisheries-related committee there was in the legislature at that time, was seafood and aquaculture. It no longer exists anymore, I don't think. I think they did away with it, and who knows what they got now. But so, yeah, those people were active, and Gene Preston sat on that committee, and boy, I'm stretching now to try to remember who else was. There was a guy from Jacksonville, kind of a round guy, was a lawyer. Can't remember his name. He was very vocal about things.
But where's the coastal, so the, state senators and representatives from coastal counties, were they generally wanting to pass the Fisheries Reform Act or blocking it? I guess they were helping it to go forward.
I think, well, in order for it to go forward, they almost had to buy in. So, but they were very active and very important in how it was structured, and, in my opinion, refused to allow implementation of certain things that I think were important, like the recreational license that was not implemented originally, finally got implemented down the road, but Senator Bass Knight and many of the other coastal legislators, because of the, I don't know what was going on in their districts, or whether it was commercial industry that saw that as a huge threat, I think, because they didn't want all anglers to know each other or who was involved and all that. I mean, they were real worried about it. And when it ultimately was passed, it was such that nobody could go in and get the list of English people that bought licenses. That was a strict prohibition, and that was at the behest of the commercial industry, because they didn't want recreational groups to be able to contact folks who they knew fished. Get them yourself if you can, but you're not going to get them from the state. So, yeah, there was, things like that.
Do you have any personal stories about some of the people that were in the trenches with you?
I do, but I'm not going to go into those now.
No clean.
No, I developed a lot of really good relationships, or I think relationships with a lot of really good people, I should probably say. Melvin Shepard being one of them, Murray Fulcher being another one, Ray Graham, who, do you know Ray? He was ran an oyster house up Mill Creek, or off of the Newport River. Bob Bryant, and there were just a bunch of great. David Bearsoff, ultimately, that I served on the Red Drum FMP committee with and co-chaired with David. I mean, I don't see David much anymore, and I miss not seeing him. He's a great guy and had a great perspective on fisheries and fisheries management, I think. It was outside the mainstream and outside of NCFA often, and it put him at odds with that crowd, but he was a big enough man to stand on his own 2 feet, and when he had a different opinion, he was not afraid to state it. So.
Okay.
Jody Gay, I guess, is somebody else that was involved at that time. He was a snapper grouper fisherman out of the southern part of the state. Served on the commission for a while. Was on the, I think he was on South Atlantic Council, at least on the snapper grouper committee at the South Atlantic Council. I can't remember whether Jody served or not.
Okay.
Those are people I remember that and being influenced. I've known BJ Copeland forever and still see him, and have always loved BJ and respected him.
So we'll transition to a little bit more of the specifics of the law, and you already hit on one, the coastal recreational fishing license. But just to review, the new law at the time had 5 focus areas: licensing, the Marine Fisheries Commission, fishery management plans, coastal habitat protection plans, and law enforcement. And some of the major provisions were, the whole license structure, the eligibility requirements for the commercial license, a cap on the number of commercial licenses, the new recreational commercial fishing gear license, the new coastal recreational fishing license, which, as you said, wasn't implemented until January 2007, so almost, a decade later. It finally required fishery management plans for all the significant species. And another big change was it reduced the size of the Marine Fisheries Commission from 17 to 9 and created, as you said, the public involvement. So you had 4 standing advisory committees that were subject matter, and then the regional advisory committees, and then the coastal habitat protection plans, which, were for wetlands, spawning areas, primary, secondary nursery areas, shellfish beds, that stuff. Of these, which provisions of the Fisheries Reform Act were most significant in your view, and why?
I think they were all significant, and I also believe that they got it pretty much right with the provisions that were passed. I mentioned the exception with the recreational license. I was disappointed to see that was not passed originally. I was not a big fan of the recreational commercial gear license, and that's still contentious to this day. Don't believe it should have ever been established. I know there was a history of small time folks who just loved to go set gill nets and pull little trawls. My younger brother did that for a number of years, and I would help him back in the early 70s and mid 70s. And it was fun. But if they had told him or told me that I couldn't do that after the Fisheries Reform Act, I would have gladly accepted it and always argued personally that it should never have been established. So that's one thing I think they got wrong. The licensing aspects.
Do you think it got, just to follow up on that just for a second, do you think it was wrong just because it allowed for gear that took more fish that probably we didn't need to?
Well, the guys, primarily folks were, especially the gill net aspects of it, or the gear that was in the hands of the recreational anglers. There were limits, starting to be limits and further more restrictive limits on finfish species that recreational anglers could take, and they still continue to be ratcheted down as, or changed, I should say, probably, as the fisheries and the populations change and management becomes necessary. You can't control how many red drum you catch in a gill net. So if you go as a recreational angler, or commercial fisherman for that matter, set a gill net somewhere and a school of red drum goes into it and you're allowed to keep one, they don't fare very well, especially in the summertime. So you're killing a bunch of fish that you can't keep or shouldn't keep by law. And so that's a problem. So when you have size limits as well as creel limits on finfish species and you're fishing them with a gill net, it's difficult to near impossible and or very wasteful to take those fish with a gill net.
Okay, thank you for that follow-up. So, sorry, continue on. So.
Yeah, so the other thing I think that was a little bit goofy was the restriction, quote unquote, of the number of commercial licenses in the state. Very early on, as someone who was active in the process, I looked at participation, and others did too, looked at participation by commercial fishermen. Numbers of people, landings, average landings, the value of the landings that were, because those were all reported once the trip ticket program was set up and the division had the data. And so there were, and to this day remain, a large number of very, very small-time, part-time, retired, whatever they are, people that hold commercial licenses. So I think in establishing the number of the cap that was sold as a restriction on the commercial industry was not a restriction on the commercial industry at all. In fact, there's still licenses that have not been sold, and the commission still will not get rid of those licenses. They're still around for somebody to pick up. if they qualify. And the qualifications are not that stringent. You just have to fish some, I think. So I think that, it probably should have been capped not at 8,300. I believe that's what it was it not? 83, 8,500, something. It was way too many. Probably should have been capped at 3,500 or somewhere down that way. And we're still, I think the article that I saw in the News and Observer this week said there were 2,000, I believe, active folks that participated last year in the fishery or in commercial fishery. So, and that's down from 3,500 or something a couple of years ago. 2,000, I believe, was the date.
So, you talked about disappointment with the coastal recreational fishing license not being passed originally.
Yeah.
What do you think that would have helped with if it had originally been passed with the rest of the package?
Well, I think it would have given it a large number more years to build up the endowment funds, to generate interest more quickly, generate interest that could be used by the Division of Marine Fisheries for their operations and research and things that were important to the, items that were important to the state and to the recreational community in particular. So that's probably the biggest overall effect, was the not getting the money stream started early enough, soon enough.
Okay. Any other areas that were significant in your mind?
Well, I think all of it was significant. The Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, establishing that, and when it finally got developed and passed, I think was very, very significant. It's difficult because of the economic impact that appropriate management and habitat preservation and enhancement and the like has on other industries like agriculture and silviculture, which are important in this state as well. So just like the argument over stream buffers that the legislature is currently talking about taking off, that was a hard-fought battle to get those buffers put on to begin with, and they're important in my mind. Water quality and habitat are extremely important to fish. And for anybody who cares about the fish and the marine resources, then you've got to care about the habitat and the water quality. So the chip was a very important aspect of it, and I was on the commission when that was finally passed and implemented. And it was important from a number of perspectives, I think, Sarah, and one was just the habitat, putting in place measures to recognize the important habitats, and some measures to protect those habitats. We haven't gone as far as we should, I don't think, in that direction. But one of the more important aspects, I think, was just getting those three departments within the state that have to approve and accept that chip to sit down and talk to each other and have an opportunity to know that the Environmental Management Commission knows what's important to the Marine Fisheries Commission, and then the coastal management as well, because they all impact each other. So just throwing all those people in the same room together so they can understand what's important to the other agencies was to me, one of the more important aspects of it.
So thinking overall, what is the greatest success or greatest successes of the Fisheries Reform Act?
Well, I think Coastal Habitat Protection Plan was an important one. Fisheries management plans were a very important aspect of it. And then downsizing the commission, getting those 17 people away from the table, and the structure of the commission as it was set up under the FRA was a great idea. So it's a whole lot easier for 9 people to sit around the table and discuss things in an efficient manner than it is for 17 people who sit around the table throwing shoes at each other. So I think those three, the FMPs, because of the making people take a hard look at the science and what needs to be done and the current condition or state of the fish populations, and then acting and having to act to make sure that those populations are sustainable.
All right, sort of now we're transitioning into maybe like the future, like if I had known when. Is there anything you know today about sort of how this all played out that you wish you had known in 1997?
Well, I think if we had known that there would still be available commercial licenses in '97, then maybe we'd gotten a little more realistic about setting the cap on the fishery. And that's kind of a moot point because, as we just talked about earlier, it hasn't grown that much. In fact, it's declining right now, so it's not a huge issue, but it's I guess, a philosophical issue that could have been addressed way back then. Maybe a few more teeth into the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, and getting that off the ground earlier. You know, it took a long time for that plan to ever be developed, and that work should have probably started a little earlier in that whole process. You know, mentioned the recreational license, and certainly that should have been implemented right off the bat. But I don't know. It's hard to think of really. I mean, I'm not disappointed with what was passed and how it's played out. I guess the only thing that I see is in this as an issue or a problem is it's probably not so much related to the FRAs, it is to the individuals that are appointed on the Marine Fisheries Commission that fail to take their responsibility as seriously or as literally as they should, and tend to be a little softer on the management measures than they need to be, in my opinion.
So thinking about sort of the challenges in the future, climate change and variability, imported seafood and changing domestic and global markets, and then the biggest thing, transition from single species management to sort of this ecosystem-based management approach. I wanted to know from you, what are your thoughts about these emerging issues related to fisheries management in North Carolina? Do you see a couple of particular issues that you think are emerging that if we don't get ahead of, you know, I don't know what I'm trying to say, basically, like, you know, like you said, Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, in hindsight, we maybe should have started that a little bit sooner because of the ramifications of the connectivity with habitat to fisheries. So is there something that's coming down the pipe that we really should get on, because it may take a while to
I'm not so sure anything's become more important now than over the last 20 years than it was back then, to be honest. You know, we're still allowing the use of some gears in our state that have a terrible impact on habitats. Trawls, I'm thinking of in particular inside. I just don't think they should be there. We're the last state that has allowed this, and us getting away from the FRA to some degree, but it is related to the habitat and the Habitat Protection Plan. And of course, those are hard issues. And when the division and the folks involved in the committees that look at these issues within the context of the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, look at trawling as it impacts habitat, it's pretty easy to get them out of grass beds because they don't want to go into grass beds anyway. It clogs their nets and they can't catch, and it's a pain in the butt to cull all the stuff out of all the grass. And oysters the same way, that tears their nets up. But they still run over a few of them and they beat them up. And dredging, oyster dredging, for example, is still allowed in certain places, and it's a very, very destructive process. And we can harvest, as other states do, oysters within our state, the small number that are here compared to what used to be, and using other gears that don't knock the whole reef down. Tongs, I'm thinking of, hand harvest, that kind of thing. So we still allow some of these practices that I think if we took a very rational look within the context of the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan and what we're doing to the habitat, that we really should come to a different conclusion. But again, it's a rambling statement that I've made, but because of those economic impacts on a small number of small-time commercial operators, it just never seems to get done. So,
and kind of just we're going into this, but what, if anything, should be changed to ensure sustainable fisheries and healthy coastal ecosystems? You pretty much, just said about the destructive gears.
I think destructive gears is one thing. I think a little greater adherence to the science and the best information that we have with regards to establishing the proper regulations. And again, that's not because we don't know. It's because the individuals that sit on the commission at times choose not to be guided as strongly or as directly by the science as I think they should. But people, I was called heartless around the Marine Fisheries Commission table one time by a fellow commission member because of a stance that I took, which was very clear to me because the science, I think, indicated that that's what we needed to do. But there were others around the table who felt so sorry for those fishermen who were impacted by that potential regulation that they just couldn't do it. They just couldn't do it. So it took old Heartless Mac to ever get it done, or help get it done.
Thinking about sort of the economy and sort of maybe a little bit of the historic fabric of our coastal communities, is there anything that should be changed to sort of ensure that there is some kind of sustainable economy out there, that they still have some kind of a maritime tradition? I guess, one thing I'm thinking of, I've heard a lot about, is stock enhancement from both sides. Both sectors have been sort of proponents of stock enhancement thing, and that could provide some jobs too. So that's where my head is going. Is there anything, is there opportunity? Is there avenues for change that could allow these coastal communities to still be sort of vibrant and rooted in maritime heritage? Yeah.
Well, those are two different things, I think. I think the maritime heritage is always going to be there. I mean, we see museums popping up here and there. I mean, there's the Mariners Museum in Beaufort, or the Maritime Museum. So the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum at Hatteras, I always encourage that crowd and I used to spend a lot of time up there to, not miss the history of the charter industry that they had at Hatteras. And I think that I hadn't been in that place, but I think they've tried to capture some of that in that exhibit. So I think there is a place for that, and there'll always be a place for that. But I think it's going to shift from down the road, and I've said this for a number of years to a number of different people, and this is just my opinion, but I think that's where it's going, rather than people coming to the coast to see shrimp boats on the waterfront. They may always see those, I don't know. Hopefully there'll be big boats that fish out in the ocean at some point down the road instead of little boats that are fishing inside. But in addition to that, assuming they're still there and still fishing offshore, then they're going to see the commercial industry depicted in more maritime museum type environments and aquariums, and homage to the industry, because they don't think it's going to exist the way it has existed as we move into the future. So I think you'll probably see more of that in museums than opposed to on the waterfront. The other thing that I think the information's to a large degree there that I don't think is appreciated as much by the general public nor the coastal communities is the impact that recreational angling has on those communities, the economic impact that recreational angling has on those communities. I don't feel like it's ever been given the recognition and importance that it deserves. It's a huge industry in the state and on the East Coast, and it always plays second fiddle to the value of the commercial and importance of the commercial industry in the coastal communities, when in fact it, from an economic perspective, is much higher. So I would hope that at some point, we can look, and the recreational anglers have heritage as well. It may not go quite as far back as the commercial industry, but there's certainly in Hatteras on the Outer Banks is a heritage of recreational angling up there. So I'd like to see that recognized a little more, I think, by the communities on the coast and the coastal legislators.
Is there anywhere to sort of cultivate or grow the economy in that sector more, or?
I think there is room for growth. I think if we chose to manage our stocks more for the recreational industry as opposed to the commercial industry, then we'd see a lot of growth in the recreational industry. There's a big difference, and you're probably aware, but there's a big difference in what the recreational community sees as an ideal fish population and what the commercial industry sees as an ideal fish population. I mean, even from fisheries management perspective, from the scientific perspective, we look at production curves, surplus production curves, and we say that we target the point on that curve that produces the most biomass. Why do we do that? We do that because that's what's most important to the commercial industry. And so that's what we look at yields. That's how we develop our yields. Those fish are not the big fish. Those fish are the smallest fish, the most rapidly growing fish, and they get to that point the quickest. So that's the most efficient place to harvest the most biomass that you can out of a fish population. I mean, I don't care, but I'm an oddball recreational angler. I like to catch lots of little fish or some medium-sized fish, and maybe occasionally a big one. It's nice to hook one every now and then. But a lot of recreational anglers would like to target and have the opportunity to catch larger fish. Well, that's not what we're managing for. So the point is there, I guess, that if we were managing for recreational harvest, we'd be managing differently than we are currently. So that kind of feeds into the economic argument in my mind as well. Do we want to maximize the value of our natural resources to the country and to our communities? Well, if we do want to do that, then we probably should take a closer look at managing more directly for the recreational side of things as opposed to the commercial sector. That's a fundamentally different way than North Carolina has been managing for a long, long time. There are other states that have gone that direction, and I think ultimately North Carolina will be forced to go that way too, but it hasn't happened yet, and it may not happen in my lifetime. But if we're serious about things and economies and growing economies in coastal communities, then that's certainly one way we can look at enhancing those economies.
And last question, is there anything else you'd like to share or add?
No,
final closing thing. I think we hit it. We were all over the place.
I said everything I wanted to say, I think, and probably more, and said it more than once.